Hey, what is going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Quarbit, and welcome to 11 amazing tips for Europa Universalis 4 that I very honestly wish I had known when I was a beginner a few years ago. Whether you're a new player or not, I'm sure that at least one of these things on the list will be useful information to you. After all, you never really stop learning things as an EU4 player. If you are a newer player, then I'll just make it clear that this is not a beginner's guide. If you're looking for a beginner's guide, I'll put some links down below in the description so you can check those out if you're looking to start from square one. Without any further rambling, let's get started. Alright, let's begin with one that gets a lot of attention, and that is the status of loans. Now, I understand that for a lot of you who are newer to the game, it feels like loans are the scariest thing out there. I mean, if your country is in debt, how can you stop yourself from spiraling further down? And this is what deters a lot of newer players from taking out loans at all. As a general rule, of course it's better to be debt-free, but loans are honestly nothing to be afraid of. Even taking out 4 or 5 or even more loans so you can ensure victory in a war is something that actually should be encouraged. To put it straightforward, ducats are temporary, but the land you take is essentially forever. Well, unless you lose a war, of course. The investment of those few loans to ensure you're consistently growing in power will be rewarding in every way, so be sure to take whatever measures necessary, even if it means a little bit of debt, or even a lot of debt. In the end, it's a load cheaper to take a bunch of loans and steamroll your enemy than to drag the war out for longer. Alright, tip number 2. Now, with the loads of buttons all over the place in the diplomatic menu, it can be obviously a bit daunting to remember all the different things you can do. For instance, have you ever tried hitting this tab before? Possibly not. It's not the tab that's special in of itself, but what lies down beneath it. A lot of players don't make effective use of the Prepare for War button as much as they should. If you have an extra 10 favors with an ally that won't join a war that you want to start, hitting this button will give them an instant plus 20 reasons to join on your side. Not only that, but if you have Cradle of Civilization and your ally is drilling their troops, they'll stop drilling them for the duration of the effect and prepare them for battle. Next is a bit of a conquering tip for you. A good general suggestion is to attempt to conquer your way towards trade modes. When you've become an experienced player, this is often second nature, but when you're conquering land, there always has to be a specific reason for taking the land other than simply because your country name gets bigger. I mean, sometimes it is that way once you get past the year 1700, but we'll talk about that a little later. When taking land, especially as a nation with very little trade at the beginning of the game like Sweden, it is vital that you expand towards centers of trade and grow your trade income. For concentrated empires, you can often end up with massively disproportionate amount of trade income in comparison to the regular tax/production income that wide empires often enjoy. Since almost every nation starts off relatively small without overwhelming influence in their home node, it's best to attempt to grab one of those first. This next tip is one you'll find a little bit more useful in your late games and is a bit more of a did you know. For instance, did you know that past the year 1700, it is possible to take as much land in 50 years or less as in the past 2 to 300 years? Having great administrative efficiency, reduced coring cost, high absolutism, and the imperialism CB, the last 100 or so years of the game can be both stressful and, in my opinion, some of the most fun. As such an obvious tip, the reason it's included is that a lot of players actually end up quitting the majority of their saves towards the 1600s or 1650s mark, which is really quite a shame. Since the 1600s are usually somewhat of the slowest in terms of satisfying gameplay, it's not weird from a player standpoint, but when you do make it to the 1700s, trust me, there will be a lot more for you to do. After such a basic tip, here's a bit more of an advanced one. Do you have an ally that's also allied to a target you're trying to take down? Well, assuming you still want that alliance, there is a way to fix that. Find a minor third party to bring your ally into a war against. They'll join on your side, essentially locking them into friendly terms with you until that war is over. This essentially means that they'll reject any defensive calls to arms against you. This is a strategy often used in world conquests, and the true masterminds use them to great benefit, but it doesn't mean that noobs can't use it from time to time as well. Just a word of warning though, if you end the minor war earlier than the big war, there's a chance that your ally will still accept the call to arms against you, so be sure to finish the big war before you peace out with the minor war. Alrighty, here's a bit of a development tip for you all. If you have a gold mine and some extra Diplo power near the early stages of the game, be sure to develop the production a whole lot in that province. If it becomes your main source of income, then so be it. There are many ways to get an amazing economy, but that's one of the most comprehensive one for newer players. It's true that there's a higher chance that the gold mine will deplete, but the trade-off in ducats you get early on will allow you to become powerful enough to not have to rely on it when it begins to fail. Next, let's talk about colonization and colonial nations for a bit. If you're planning on doing any sort of colonization in the game, don't forget to take every single bonus you can possibly take. Whether it's an event, any sort of bonus, be sure to use it as much as possible, and try to avoid colonizing anything that gives you a debuff for colonization, like tundra, arid, or dense jungle if you can. Now, a bit of an obvious one, but try to focus on one colony at a time. Not only that, but when figuring out where to settle in a region, look for the natural trade harbors. These are often the places you'll want to settle first, since they give your colony, and by extension yourself, massive trading bonuses. Also, when looking for a colonial region to settle, look for the one that will end up transferring trade to you. For instance, it makes less sense for Spain to colonize Canada over, say, the Caribbean, since the Gulf of St. Lawrence has no connection to Sevilla. And just as a final part of that compact tip, don't forget that most colonial nations won't have enough income to pay you taxes as well as colonize surrounding areas. To remedy this, don't forget to subsidize your colony between 2 and 4 ducats per month until they reach around 10 cities. At that point, it's usually fine to let them continue from there. Before you reach the 1700s, you'll of course still want to take tons of land for minimal aggressive expansion and cost. But how can you do that when every province you take costs tons of admin and everyone hates you for it? Introducing Reconquest Vassals. Now, there are lots of reasons why vassals are essentially Daddy Jake's blessing on this world. I could make an entire video on it, and maybe I will, but for now, here's what you need to know. Search for the cores of dead nations within bigger ones. Let's say, for instance, you've just won a war against the French as Castile or Aragon. France happens to have a lot of little cores of dead nations that no longer exist in her lower territories. Wow, that sounds a lot more suggestive than it was supposed to. Anyway, you can release a nation from its cores even if it never existed. So long as it has the core, you can go down to the bottom of your own diplomatic screen and hit this little button to release a nation from your territory. Usually, this little nation will also have a few extra cores in the country you'd like to invade once again in the future. The Reconquest CB grants 75% aggressive expansion, and the cost of returning those provinces is lessened, allowing you to essentially take more in the war as well. If you're a newer player and you're wondering exactly what happens when you go above the 100% overextension mark, I'll give you a little explanation so you don't have to experience it yourself. Essentially, you get loads of nasty debuffs the more overextended you are, although this is probably something you've noticed yourself already. However, you know those rebellions that keep ticking up in a percentage over time? Well, having over 100% overextension multiplies their growth rate by 3 times. Countries are more likely to declare on countries with high overextension, and are also more likely to join coalitions against them. And the little cherry on top is the yearly events you get, which often create up to 15 local unrest for 5 years in parts of your nation. However, here's where the tip comes in. You can still take way over 100% overextension in a war, meaning you can have your cake and eat it too. A simple way of getting rid of overextension is creating a vassal from cores and feeding it a vast amount of overextension from surrounding territories. If you're willing to put down the rebels for them, it's a great return investment, having to spend significantly less admin yourself. Here's one I bet a lot of you don't often think about, but sometimes it actually is worth letting a pretender take the throne. If you have a 1/1/1 king and there's a pretender with a strong claim to the throne having a 4/3/5 stat, there's really no reason you shouldn't just let him have the throne. Other than the big prestige hit and possible legitimacy dip, the monarch points generated will be well worth your troubles. And finally, here we are at the 11th amazing tip. If you liked the video so far, don't forget to leave a like and let me know if you want to see another one of these in the future. Not only does it sate my constant need for approval, but also helps a little bit out with the good old algorithm, you know. Right then, EU4 is a war game, but military muscle is not the means to an end. Unless you are Space Marine Prussia or Ottomans, or so strong that no one in the world can rival you, there will always come a time where you'll be up against an enemy about as strong or much stronger than yourself. Fighting him head-on will inflict heavy damage to you, sometimes even fatal if you're not careful. Identify the bottleneck and use them to your advantage. Do they rely heavily on trade to fill their coffers? Try privateering the trade nodes to cut off their supply and starve them out of mercenaries. Do they have strong allies? Attack one of their weakest allies to drag them in and use that to nullify their other alliances. Oftentimes this will also lead other nations to dogpile on them in their weakened state. So those were my 11 amazing tips for EU4 that honestly I really do wish I had known when I started the game. This game has so many nuances and little details that I wouldn't mind making another one of these in the future if it's requested enough. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more EU4 guides in the future. My current goal is to get 1,000 subs before my birthday in May, so let's work together to reach that goal. With that, this is Quarbit signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day.